Hello. How are you? Today I am back with my first book review since, oh my gosh, September. I know this has taken me way too long, but in the month since, I haven't really read anything I want to talk about at length, but that's a little besides the point. Today I am reviewing A Wizard's Dream by Hrvoje Butkovic, a standalone fantasy novel branded by the author himself as an unconventional work of fantasy. Now, this is a special review because I was given a digital copy of this book in exchange for this review, and I want to give my honest thoughts about this work. If you're interested in hearing what I have to say and want to see more stuff from me, then make sure to like and subscribe. And strap your butts in, because here we go! Before I do anything, however, I want to do some clarifying. What I'll specifically be focusing on for this review is each aspect of the story and how well the author's ideas and overall visions are executed. A Wizard's Dream is meant to be a slow paced and contemplative and thought-provoking story, so I will be taking those things into consideration when examining each part of the book. I had a lot of thoughts by the time I was finished, and it was tricky condensing all of those points into the ones that I really wanted to discuss. I want it on the record that no book is perfect, and to attain what the average human would perceive as perfection is statistically impossible. Literature, as with all forms of art, is subjective. Some will like it, some might not like it, others might be indifferent. But I won't really be discussing my enjoyment for this particular review. At least, I will on occasion, but not as much as I'll be talking about the execution as I've said. So with that out of the way, let's start with the review proper. We're starting with the plot, and buckle yourselves in because this is a bit of a doozy. Then again, that's the point. A Wizard's Dream is the coming-of-age tale of a young dwarf wizard named Azia, and the story follows her and her traveling partner Vagran as they make their way in the world of Amana. Azia's dream is to help her adoptive people, the dwarves, and after receiving a vision from the goddess Amma, Azia sets off to train under a pair of very peculiar magicians. Interspersed throughout Azia's story are various short tales of occurrences happening in the world, including the fall of the Mer Kingdom, a group of settlers leaving their home to start a new life in the outside world, and a man who gets shipwrecked on a mysterious island, among others. It's clear that Azia's story is the central narrative given that she is the protagonist. The other narratives occur throughout and take place at varying points throughout the timeline of events. This means that the events of A Wizard's Dream do not occur in a linear sequence. This by itself is fine, and you can get away with putting story events in a structure like this if you know what you're doing. However, it's very important to think about a scene's contributions to the main arc and its place in the story. Is it in some way tied to the main character's arc or journey? Does it contribute anything at all to the main narrative? Will the characters and the side plots eventually interact with the main characters by the end? Will the subplot at any point converge with the main arc? If not, then it's better to leave it out of the finished product, because at that point there's not much of a reason for it to be there. Thinking of one example off the top of my head, and without divulging too much, the chapter Lament features a character named Enwar, whose ship Lament is wrecked at sea, and he finds himself washed up on the shore of a mysterious land. His story ends with him reuniting with his shipmates after being featured for 2 chapters. Both of Enwar's chapters occur in the first quarter of the book, and he's never mentioned again, not even in passing. Another example I want to cover is the tale of Toril and his fellow settlers as they start a new life in an area populated by dangerous man-eating creatures called felines. It's heavily implied that Toril's story involves the expansion of civilization within the main continent of Amana, but he and his exploits are never mentioned outside of his chapters. I also want to point out that there are several vaguely abstract scenes within A Wizard's Dream, including the creation of phenomena known as skylights and the reunion of 2 trees that seek to be together again after a long time apart. These can be fine by themselves, but again, they need to connect in some way to the main story. Back to Azia's story, her arc is, I would say, the best of all the character arcs we get, which, with her being the protagonist, works very much in her favor. When we're introduced to Azia, she and Vagran are hunting down a group of goblin raiders that have destroyed a dwarf village. They both travel to inform the higher-ups of the destruction that has taken place, but later have to deal with a much greater threat. We also get glimpses of Azia's past, including her first meeting with Vagran and the event that leads her to study wizardry. Again, Azia's arc is the best of the many that we get, and I have to say the story ended in a way I didn't expect it to. The ending did come as a surprise after the build-up and the allusion to the high stakes that were established, but I appreciated its open-ended nature and how it indicated that things were still hopeful for Azia, and she still had a chance to turn things around for herself in spite of her circumstances. Since we're discussing character arcs and such, let's move on to the characters themselves. Over the course of A Wizard's Dream, the reader is introduced to a wide and varied cast of characters, each playing differing roles in the story. There are many characters that we meet to the point where it's honestly a bit hard to keep track of them all. But for the sake of this review, I'm going to talk about the ones that have the most importance, starting with Asya and Vagran. But before I cover them, I want to point out that while I was writing the notes for this review, Asya kept autocorrecting to Asia, and Vagran kept autocorrecting to Vagrant. That's glorious, I love that. Asya is a wizard who seeks to help the dwarves and hopes to become their strongest mage. Even though she was raised among the dwarves and has the appearance of one, Asya was born as a fish-like creature called a mer. Her companion Vagran is a thunderrock, a bird-like creature made entirely of lightning who can also manipulate lightning as he wishes. Because of what he is, he's widely feared and shunned by just about everyone besides Asya. Despite them both being outcast in some way, neither of them are overtly bothered by it, and in regards to achieving her ultimate goal, Asya is undeterred by this fact. Vagran, on the other hand, just doesn't care. Asya and Vagran are, as befitting of their roles as the main characters, a compelling duo, and I personally think their personalities complement each other nicely. Asya wears her heart on her sleeve more compared to Vagran, who comes off as being more grounded. We're led to like them both from the start, and I found myself invested in Asya's character arc early on. Asya does have some peculiar reservations at the beginning, particularly concerning the goblins, but she does switch gears as the story progresses. It was very fascinating seeing the foundations and other components of her end goal change as things were happening around her, and she got caught up in increasingly higher stakes. The other pair of characters that stood out to me the most were Asya's wizard mentors, Char and Florella. The difference between these two is a lot more noticeable, and they're opposites on almost every level. Char is some sort of rock and or magma-like being who comes off as being blunt, aloof, a bit of a jerk, and happily embraces chaos, whereas Florella is a plant-like being who has a milder, nicer demeanor than Char does. While they're definitely suspicious, no spoilers, they play a significant role in Asya's story, and their presence sets the stage for the events of the second half of the book. The reader also meets a wide cast of supporting characters, some more connected to the main story than others. From Demotai, the kind of sort of necromancer, to Lyra, a prominent figure among the Mers who witnesses the fall of her kingdom. That about covers all of the characters who have the most relevance, and even though A Wizard's Dream has a solid main cast, the number of characters there are in total makes juggling all of them a greater task than it needs to be. To prevent confusion when writing a book with multiple perspectives, and this is just going off my own experience, it's better to keep the number of POVs relatively low, like 4 or 5, but chances are you can get away with having 6. Throughout the entirety of A Wizard's Dream, we get introduced to no less than 10 POV characters across the book. Not only that, but by the end, the cast is so large that, like I said, it's hard to keep track of them all. You'll have characters coming in and out of the story before they've made any significant impact on the reader, and we often get characters mentioned by name who only appear once or twice. Some even make an appearance without a formal introduction. By introducing more and more characters, you're not giving the reader enough time to connect meaningfully with them, and you're not giving the characters enough of a chance to stand out. Also, another thing regarding the more minor characters, just about all of whom are mentioned by name, and this is something I learned during a writing class in college. You should only mention a character by name if they play a major role in a scene or the story as a whole. If they're just going to be a blip on the radar, then mentioning them by name isn't needed. Much of the cast has the potential to shine, but with so many characters introduced, they just get pushed more to the wayside than they should be. The world building is unquestionably the strongest part of A Wizard's Dream. There are many races that inhabit Amana, including the typical humans, dwarves, elves, and goblins that one may find in classical fantasy novels. The reader is also introduced to different races and creatures, including Mers, which are implied to be fish-like or mermaid-like creatures complete with scales, and we also get a bird-like species called rocks. It's stated in the book that there are at least 2 species of rocks, thunder rocks and pyre rocks, made entirely of elemental energy depending on what species they are. There are also demons, but we don't talk about them. Each race is very different from the next. The reader is given decent impressions of what each race is like, from the apparent destructiveness of the humans to the power-hungry tendencies of the Morlocks, who I think are affiliated with the Mers. There is a conflict between multiple races established at the very beginning, with both the dwarves and elves united against the goblins by the time the ball gets rolling. However, when reading A Wizard's Dream, one shouldn't just fix their attention on the characters. What makes the world building of the story stand out is the world itself. There are very generous amounts of world building and scene setup, and the world itself is very atmospheric. Through scene descriptions, we're introduced to a world with a unique level of sentience and agency not usually seen in fantasy. Or anywhere, really. The land itself, and I think all of the worlds mentioned in the story, are personified to some degree. For example, you have masculine mountains and rays of light, along with feminine flames and plant life, among other things. Also inhabiting the world are beings called astrals, who are practically their own universes and harborers of stars, along with angel-like beings called celestials. Which brings me to my personal favorite part of the world building, the sort of dimension hopping and metaphysical stuff that we're introduced to when Asya undergoes her wizard training. There seems to be a form of dimension hopping introduced briefly in the story, and we see multiple universes in varying stages of development, along with different dimensions with their own functions. Perhaps the two that stood out to me the most were Firmament, also known as Paradise, which serves as a place of dream creation. The other realm I thought was interesting was the Chaos Plane, also known as the Purgatory Plane. At least I'm fairly certain they're the same. A realm that seems to be quite sporadic and turbulent in behavior, capable of showing a visitor memories and scenes of their past. Though it also seems to have a mind of its own and can also form very strange sights and sounds. You know, totally not true to its name. Something else that I thought was very interesting was that worlds have their own wants and needs, and their survival depends entirely on whether its inhabitants meet those needs. If their needs aren't met, well, that would be a bad thing for the people living on that world. It's a very interesting twist added on to what I thought was one of the most interesting parts of the world building. I also found the personification of the world to be a fascinating aspect, and the scene with the trees reuniting is definitely a scene that stood out to me. I wish we got more things from the world in that vein, like moving mountains and shifting landscapes. I also wish we got more of the astrals, especially since they seem like beings with immense power. I mean, miniature universes? That by itself gives them untold potential, and I wish we got more of them. Other than that, however, I greatly enjoyed the world building. And now we move from the best part of a wizard's dream to the one that could use a bit of work. Not to say the prose is bad, but keep in mind the execution of a writing style can in some cases make or break a book. I should mention the fact that the author changed up his writing style specifically for a wizard's dream. The writing style of choice has a lot of potential to be used effectively, and I applaud the willingness to try something new. The prose in A Wizard's Dream is very poetic, very vivid, and very flowery. Again, that by itself is fine if you can do it right. However, the thing about the prose, and its most glaring issue, is that it tends to get overly descriptive and more often than not, at least from my own impressions, drowns out all of the happenings occurring in the story, turning an already slow-paced story even slower, perhaps slower than intended. There's nothing wrong with a slow-paced book, but there's a fine line between having a slow pace and being packed to the brim with unnecessary filler. Another thing to think about, and a very important component of writing, is word choice, or using certain words to convey certain feelings or describe certain things. There are some bits where the writing shines, a particular example being on page 25. It was a different world then. Dwarves' lives were savage and short. And yet there was something about it that had captivated her. Their foes were enormous and deadly, but clear and uncomplicated. Their own heroic deeds were courageous but straightforward. It was a simple struggle for survival. They knew what they had to do for their people to thrive, and they went ahead and did it despite tremendous dangers and personal cost. I find this passage to be just the right amount of lyrical, not straying too far from its aim and the story it's trying to tell. There's another bit in this vein on page 21 that also manages to strike this balance. As the clouds thinned out, the southern Earl face came into view. Vagran gazed at the two walls of rock who spread out across the land like earthy waves frozen in mid-surge, barely visible in the faint light of a faraway sun. They hoisted 12 summits upon their shoulders, the heart of the Peruvius range. It was a landscape he had only ever seen at night, mindful of the dwarves' fear of his kind, before the border clashes brought him out in the light of day and urged him to act. Poetic but concise is the key. I feel like the novel would have been a lot stronger if the writing style kept this balance the whole way through, perhaps being more descriptive when conveying a character's feelings or during a scene setup. Back to the matter of word choice, though. Personally, I think too much of the focus during the creative process went into the prose itself, and trying to get it to push the boundaries of lyricism, something that I believe another reviewer of this book pointed out. And it's because of this that all the other parts of the story suffer severely for it, not getting enough chance to stand out. Not only that, there are multiple questionable decisions that make the poetry of the prose bend backward and backfire entirely. For the purpose of saving time, I'm only going to list off what I thought were the most egregious examples, but hopefully you all get the general gist of what I'm trying to say. On the opening page, we're introduced to a group of children about to listen to Asya's story. Their emotions are described as subdued and enthusiastic. These are two very contradicting descriptors that by their nature would cancel each other out. Putting two opposites in the same sentence together will confuse at least a few readers, although you could probably get away with saying that they tried to keep their excitement from showing on their faces. There's another blunder on page 49 when pointy denizens of the celestial night is used to describe skylights along with Rainbows. I think in this case, luminous and colorful could replace pointy to make the descriptor a bit stronger. The last bit that I want to discuss is a passage on page 54. The foothills sprawled out beneath the precipice, their pastel contours brightening with every rise and melting into the shadow with each dip. Air currents combed through their fur, the tall seed-bearing stalks of grass and wheat, animating them and bringing them to life until the breeze ran out of fabric, retiring from his labor by the crimson channel of River Rust. Upon the first read-through, I thought the descriptor fur was in reference to Vagran's plumage, and it took me 2 more tries to realize the line was in reference to the grass and wheat. There's also an instance much later on where rainbows are described as throbbing and fluttering, and in one scene, Char's eyes widen but his face gives nothing away, despite the fact that his eyes widening is already an indicator that something is on his mind. Of course, there's plenty more examples, but I'd be stretching this out longer than necessary. Something that could help is taking time to observe the things you're trying to write about and describe them accordingly. Think of how they behave in their environments, their appearance, their textures, like leaves, bricks, that sort of thing. My point is, word choice is everything. There is a difference between lyricism and potentially confusing your readers. Understanding where that line is could greatly benefit you in the long run. According to the wiki, more on that in a bit, there are several major themes that the narrative of A Wizard's Dream tackles, some of them standing out more than others. I want to talk about the 2 that I feel were executed the best, but I will also touch on some recurring themes that I picked up based on my own interpretation of the novel. The core concept of A Wizard's Dream is the meaning of one's life purpose, and who the person aspires to be. Instead of a vessel with a dream, Asya is meant to be a dream with a physical vessel. This is used to great effect, but to elaborate any further would mean dropping major spoilers. Sorry. Of all of the themes that the story intends to explore, this particular theme is perhaps the most fleshed out, if that makes sense. For much of the story, Asya tries to stand by her initial goal of helping the dwarves as their strongest mage, but her external circumstances drive her to discover her true goal. Sometimes the purpose we strive for might not be what was meant for us, which is fine because sometimes that changes for our benefit. Which leads me to the other theme that I thought was the most well executed: a person's authenticity. That is, aligning oneself to the essence of their dream and committing to it. Instead of asking whether a choice is inherently good or bad, or whether a person is good or bad based on their actions, the question becomes a matter of whether or not the choice is aligned with who one is and whether or not it speaks to them in an authentic manner. Asya grows and develops as a character throughout the story, and encounters many circumstances that lead to a change in the perspectives from what she had at the start of the book. Again, no spoilers, but I believe the matter of authenticity is what allows Asya to stand up for herself in tough situations later in the book. There are also a couple of thematic aspects that I picked up on based on my own interpretation of the book, as I said. I'm not sure if they were intentionally included, but I feel like they deserve a mention since I found that they were both intrinsically tied to Asya's story. Probably because I'm fond of character arcs. Anyway, Asya encounters multiple hurdles, not just on her path to wizardry, but outside that as well. During her wizard training, Asya comes face to face with the horrors: Pariah, Martyr, Tyrant, and the Hag, each representing a different part of Asya. Pariah is reminiscent of Asya's struggle to fit in among the dwarves, and going off what's been given in the text, Martyr seems representative of Asya's initial commitment to the well-being of the dwarves, while the Hag seems more standoffish with the other wizards. Then we have Tyrant, a horror who I believe represents the darker, scarier parts of Asya that she's instinctively tucked away. As part of her training, Asya conquers these dark aspects of herself and finds ways to come to terms with them. The horrors aren't the only darkness that Asya has to overcome, however. Amidst and in spite of everything that gets thrown her way, Asya comes to survive and flourish in the face of it all, and even when the odds come to be stacked against her, she stands up for what she believes in and what she feels is right. And I did appreciate the emphasis on these particular themes. In a way, I feel that Asya is similar to her mentor, Florella. Both of them have suffered heartbreak and loss in getting to where they are, but to paraphrase a line from the book, they both overcame their challenges and blossomed in spite of it. There's a fair bit of symbolism and story elements regarding these themes, and it just shows that one shouldn't give up in the face of darkness. They might be stronger than they think. There are other themes that I wish stood out a bit more. Again, this loops back to the issues with the writing style, along with another issue that I'll be covering in just a second. But for the most part, they stood out well enough to have a meaningful presence in Asya's story, and their value is used to good effect as Asya develops as a character. So on that front, I would say the themes were executed fairly well. Now for the last few bits that don't necessarily fit into the other categories. These may be exposition, additional story details, or other little things that I want to point out. And there are several. A Wizard's Dream has many good ideas, some that are excellent, but I think another issue with the narrative is that there's simply too much going on. Again, this is meant to be an unconventional work, but when you're faced with the amount of stuff going on, that's just more stuff to keep track of as you write, and this opens up the possibility of leaving more and more plot holes and unanswered questions. It's fine to leave things up to audience interpretation, but if those issues are meant to be solved by the end, then it's important to keep track of them so that they're not lost in everything else going on. Toral's story comes to mind, for example, but there's one more thing to point out. By the time of the prologue, Asya is known as the Dream Seer, and she is told by Char that she can see people's dreams. But in between the prologue and Asya being told this information, we're not given enough context clues to show that this is the case. Maybe before Asya begins her training, she could have an incident where she accidentally steps into another person's dream, and because of this she becomes curious about the strange ability. Or maybe she could read someone's goals and ambitions by staring into their eyes or something. You get what I mean. It's probably the scale of the story itself that keeps Asya's ability from getting the spotlight it deserves. And ultimately, the ability that gives her her title just gets lost in the vastity of plot points and story elements and whatnot. Which brings me to another related point. Something that you will see in a good portion of fantasy novels is a glossary at the front or at the back, listing off all of the things a reader needs to know if ever they get lost with a term exclusive to the book's world. The Mask of Mirrors by Emma Carrick and The Light of All That Falls, the last book of James Islington's Lycanius trilogy, both have glossaries included. This is my 2 cents, but with everything going on and all of the terms the reader is introduced to, a glossary is one of the things that could be beneficial for anyone who picks up a wizard's dream. There is also a dedicated wiki providing additional information that is not given in the context of the book itself. But the thing is, a reader shouldn't have to consult the wiki for these kinds of things. Yes, wikis serve as encyclopedias of information, but the concepts and everything else a reader needs to know should be given in the book itself within the story's context. And that's even with a glossary included. Had this sort of information been given in the story, the reader could have been given some valuable exposition and insight into the phenomena and happenings within Amana. Ultimately, A Wizard's Dream is a novel with potential and has an interesting foundation, but some tightening of plot points and overall writing style could have made it even better. That being said though, you should still read this book if you like unorthodox storytelling, wizardry, and unique world building that stands out in a genre where world building is half the battle. If you're a fan of lyrical prose and tales of self-discovery and overcoming hardships, this may also be the book for you. If what I had to say piqued your interest, then you'll be happy to know that A Wizard's Dream is available on Amazon and through the Barnes & Noble website. Again, thank you to the author for providing me a copy of this book in exchange for this review. And that is going to do it for my longest book review yet. It's a miracle my vocal cords haven't done a magic trick and given out. Anyway, if you made it to the end, thank you for sticking around. Leave a book emoji in the comments if you made it this far. If you want to see more from me, then make sure to like and subscribe. I post new videos every other Monday. Sometimes I'll do book reviews such as this one, but other times I'll just draw and vibe and whatnot. So maybe that's something you're into. Anyway, thanks for watching.